Kia ora. This presentation is to introduce you to a specific protest which took place during the 1970s at a time when Māori political issues around land grievances were gaining a lot of momentum. As the learner, I would like you to take away from this presentation an insight into why this protest took place and the importance of the outcome to Māori people, not just at the time, but today. We will look at the background to this protest and more widely what was happening politically at the time. This presentation has an audio component added on some slides, like this one you are listening to. So if you're keen for further information and insights into the Raglan land protest beyond the information in the slides, please click on these as you journey through this presentation. I hope you enjoy this presentation, but above all, I hope you learn something new. My name is Rebecca Smith, and I am your tutor for this lesson. Thank you very much. Let's take a brief look at some post-Second World War facts that are helpful to set some context here. Rapid population growth and fertility rates were high. During the 1950s, natural increase for the Māori population surged to more than 4% per year. This is close to the maximum possible increase for a group closed to migration. The average life expectancy also increased. The second migration, Māori transformed from a mostly rural people to a predominantly urban one. The second Māori migration has been described as one of the most rapid urban transitions recorded for any population before the 1970s. During the Second World War, Māori had been conscripted into urban-based industries, and men had volunteered for overseas military service at exceptionally high rates. After the war, population pressures on sparse rural resources, the manufacturing boom, and higher wages provided further reasons for Māori to move. Assisted by targeted government relocation programs, Māori left their rural homelands in droves. By 1971, 71% of Māori lived in urban areas, compared with just 26% in 1945. Though unequivocally an urban-based people, Māori were still less likely than Pākehā to live in densely populated metropolitan areas. This point is specifically focused on land ownership and alienation. When the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1940, Māori owned more than 66 million acres of land. By 1975, almost 97% had been sold or taken. Today, Māori freehold land comprises approximately 5.5%. The cultural and social changes that ensued were rapid and far-reaching. Traditional institutions and patterns of social organisation were replaced by new identities and forms of associations that marked a break from tribally structured rural life. Let's move on now to the specific movement, and this slide outlines the key dates in the Raglan protest and will be discussed further in the following slides. At the end of the Second World War, the land was not returned to Tainui at Whero as promised. Instead, the government gave it to the council, who in return leased it to the Raglan golf course. At this point, I believe it's appropriate to talk about some of the social consequences of the confiscation of land such as this. As a direct impact of this action, the whole community was displaced, forced to leave their homes, their marae, large kumara cultivations, and urupa, which is burial ground, cemetery, or graveyard. As required by law, some compensation was paid, but many refused to accept the government's money. Some called it black pennies, or the money of corruption. A small consolation could be taken by the people on the land at the time that it would be returned at the end of the war, and that no harm would befall the urupa. The Raglan golf course eventually covered 63 of the 88 acres of government land the government had initially taken. However, the marae and houses were levelled without any reference to the original owners. Some access to a 4-acre kumara garden was retained, although only temporarily. The two urupa resisted development as the golf course bunkers. They were able to remain disturbed, but mostly intact. Tainui at Whero was offered £330 in compensation for their loss, which they refused to accept, preferring the return of their lands in full. In 1972, Eva Rickard accepted the wishes of her dying mother and took up the cause of seeking to return the land and began a submission writing and petitioning effort. Her battle with prominent bodies saw her thrust into the limelight as a lands rights campaigner. The Raglan golf course protest continued. In 1975, Eva joined Turupu o Matakite and played a leading role in the Land March that same year. Being on the march enabled her to work with other protest groups and enlist support for her own cause. Later that year, she occupied the golf course and was arrested. Her subsequent prosecution overturned on appeal. At the time, only 5% of New Zealand was in Māori hands, and protesters were calling for no more Māori land to be taken away. The hikoi raised public and official awareness of Māori concerns. The protest in 1976 focused on the desecration of the urupu. February 1978. The Raglan golf course was occupied for a second time by 250 protesters comprising members of the Tainui at Whero and other groups that had been involved in the land march. After karakia and an acknowledgement of the violation that had occurred against their ancestors, the group then proceeded to fence off the urupu. In the court case that followed, it was agreed the land ought to be returned, but that Tainui at Whero should pay for it. Eva declined, refusing to pay for land that rightfully belonged to the iwi. She even turned down the Department of Māori Affairs when it attempted to defuse the situation by offering to pay for the land. Buying the land with public money would make it public land. Eva was arrested with 16 others and swore she would occupy the land again if she had to. In the aftermath of the 1978 occupation, the government again offered the land to Tainui at Whero, this time for a sum to be paid per annum over 30 years. The golf club would be given to the end of their lease in 2007 to vacate. It was an offer that history dictated should never be accepted. The outcome of this protest is that the government reworked its position until finally in 1983, 5 years after the last occupation, the land now known as Whenengaroa Te Ke Whenua was returned to the iwi and the golf course made way for a kokiri training centre, farm and marae. That day was part of the turning of the tide for the lands rights movement, and a number of factors raised the profile of this movement and brought attention to the Tiriti o Waitangi. These factors are the timing. 1970 was highly charged politically, so the timing of this protest and subsequent trial meant it was widely publicised. The historic 1975 Māori Land Rights March and the significance of this to end alienation of Māori land raised public and official awareness of concerns. Both Bastion Point and Raglan occupations sought to bring attention to land grievances, and with successful outcomes of both. The establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975, though at the time the legislation limited the scope of inquiry to grievances occurring after 1975. An important influence of the Waitangi Tribunal has been the focus that has provided for the reality of breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi and the disastrous consequences for Māori people. This focus has resulted in many attempts by government to redress the extreme hardship suffered by Māori as a result of being dispossessed of their lands. Continued outcome, though indirect, of the protest and the attention it has brought to Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
As previously mentioned, the political activism of the 1970s brought public and official attention to the treaty, specifically breaches of the treaty through land alienation and the disastrous consequences for Maori. However, there were outcomes and actions indirectly due to these movements. As mentioned, the 70s served to address specific land issues, but beyond that, the profile was raised on the inequality that exists. And since that time, New Zealand and the government has been more focused on redress to our Māori population. Significant developments of the 2 decades following the political movements of the 70s occurred, as listed below. Each of these are significant in terms of redress and reconciliation of the past. What have been some of the social impacts of this movement? We have already looked at some of the indirect impacts of the protests of the 70s and the benefit this has had in terms of shining the light on Māori land challenges, but also beyond land. The social impact of the political movement of the 70s was a catalyst for a number of changes in government policy in regards to the return of Māori land, such as the extended Waitangi Tribunal in 1985. Looking more broadly, one significant development worth noting, which is on the following slide when discussing Māori development practice initiatives, because I believe it's also appropriate here to discuss, is the Māori Language Act, which came into force in 1987. This was significant because it recognised Te Reo Māori as an official language of New Zealand. Today, in 2019, it is difficult to book into a Te Reo class because of the long waiting list. This is progress.
Why was and is this still important in 2019? In 1985, the government extended the Waitangi Tribunal jurisdiction to claims about any alleged breach of the treaty since 1840. Hundreds of historical claims ensued. I would like to talk you through an example of my iwi, Ngāi Tahu, and how this settlement has and will continue to address many of the issues facing Māori as a result of land alienation. Ngāi Tahu made its first claim against the Crown for breach of contract 149 years ago. In the 20 years from 1844, Ngāi Tahu signed formal land contracts with the Crown for some 34.5 million acres, approximately 80% of the South Island, Te Waipunamu. The Crown failed to honour its part of those contracts when it did not allocate 1/10 of the land to the iwi as agreed. It also refused to pay a fair price for the land. Robbed of the opportunity to participate in land-based economy alongside the settlers because the Crown failed to honour its contractual undertakings, Ngāi Tahu became an impoverished and virtually landless tribe. Its full claim involved some 3.4 million acres of lost land, 1/10 of the Ngāi Tahu lands total sold to the Crown. When Ngāi Tahu first took its case to the courts in 1868, the government passed laws to prevent the courts from hearing or ruling on the case. A commission of inquiry a decade later had its funding halted by the Crown to prevent it completing its work. In 1887, Royal Commissioner Judge Mackay said only a substantial endowment of land secured to Ngāi Tahu ownership would go some of the way to right so many years of neglect. The tribunal cannot avoid the conclusion that the Crown acted unconscionably and in repeated breach of the Treaty of Waitangi. As a consequence, Ngāi Tahu has suffered grave injustices over more than 140 years. The tribe is clearly entitled to very substantial redress from the Crown. These grave injustices based on the unconscionable theft by the Crown are the basis of the claim which Ngāi Tahu has pursued, as well as stolen land and food sources, fisheries and forests. The claim relates even to hospitals and schools, which Crown agents had promised would be built and provided for iwi in each area when the land purchases were made.
Ngāi Tahu suffered no openly declared raupatu or confiscations, as happened in the north. However, the Crown's action in taking land and refusing to meet its contract obligations to allocate 1/10 to the iwi deprived 5 generations of the tribe of virtually all the land and resources required to survive at anything other than subsistence level. By the early 1900s, fewer than 2,000 Ngāi Tahu remained alive in their own land. The negotiations, which began in 1991, were suspended unilaterally by the Crown in 1994. Following the intervention of the then Prime Minister Mr. Jim Bolger, negotiations were resumed in 1996. The passage of the Ngāi Tahu Claim Settlement Act on the 29th of September 1998. Ngāi Tahu received cultural redress in the form of confirmation of the ability for Ngāi Tahu to express its traditional kaitiaki relationship with the environment, tribal redress, an apology from the Crown, acknowledgement of the role of our taonga auraki, and economic redress in the form of a payment of 170 million plus. The ability to purchase the property from the Crown. This final acknowledgement has allowed the tribe to establish itself as an economic powerhouse within the South Island. Today, Ngāi Tahu has interest in fishing, tourism, property, as well as a diversified equities portfolio, all of which are managed through Ngāi Tahu holdings. The financial security enables the tribe to deliver social benefits back to iwi members.